Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Nick Up, the ADHD podcast. I'm the host, Kyle. Welcome to the show. Today, we're talking about relationships and ADHD and the things that actually matter. Happy New Year to everybody. I hope you had a good time with whatever you did. Hope you had a good Christmas. Me personally, I'm kind of glad that it's all out of the way. I'm not Grinch. I'm not Scrooge. Nothing like that. I don't like the change of routine and shops being closed and all of the other nonsense that comes with it. I prefer I prefer things to be repetitive and not change too much. So I feel like more than anything, it throws me off for a couple of weeks. But I'll be glad when it all gets back to normality, whatever normality is. That is the typical. That's the word I'm going to use for normal from now on. Is typical. But yeah, let's get into the show. So this episode isn't about blaming ADHD, and it isn't about blaming partners, and it's definitely not about excusing behaviour. It's about understanding what's actually happening in the relationship where ADHD is involved, because when there's no understanding, people fill the gaps with assumptions, and those assumptions are what cause the damage. So this episode is for people with ADHD, and more importantly is for the partners of people with ADHD, because most ADHD relationships break down. I don't think they happen because people don't care. In one sense, they happen because people don't understand what they're dealing with. I mentioned about people not caring. I will touch on that subject again. But for now, we're going to move into the way that I've structured this episode to go. I've tried to use Nick Up, obviously the name of the show, as a guideline, I suppose, and try and channel it that way. So the first thing with N would obviously normally be novelty. I've used the needs for that. So I think one of the biggest myths in ADHD relationships is that ADHD is about effort or motivation or attitude, and it isn't. ADHD is a neurodevelopmental condition, and that means that the brain develops and functions differently, particularly in areas responsible for things like emotional regulation or impulsivity or impulse control, could say, motivation and executive function. So when someone reacts quickly, intensely, or just emotionally, that isn't moral failure, it's a neurological difference, a difference between brains. And that's where the phrase that you're just blaming ADHD becomes extremely damaging. Because what that does is it assumes that everyone's got the same neurological control, the same processing speed, and the same emotional regulation, and they don't. People with ADHD still have responsibility, but they don't always have the same control in the moment. And confusing responsibility with control, that creates shame instead of solutions. Responsibility means repairing harm, apologizing, reflecting, and working on yourself. Whereas control, that's about how quickly emotions rise and how easily they can be regulated in real time. In ADHD, emotional responses can happen before conscious regulation's fully engaged. So that means that reactions may be faster and emotions may be stronger, and recovery can take even longer. That's not refusal, it's timing. So everyone has emotional needs in relationships, obviously. What ADHD does and doesn't do is it doesn't create new needs. It just amplifies existing ones, just makes them louder. But common ADHD related needs, they include reassurance, clarity, consistency, and the biggest one is probably emotional availability. Many people with ADHD also struggle with emotional permanence, and that means emotional security fades faster when reassurance, affection, or communication drops. So when a partner says, "I don't need that much reassurance," that doesn't mean that the ADHD partner is excessive. It means two nervous systems are operating differently. So that isn't manipulation, it isn't weakness, that is neurology. So that's the needs part covered for now. Going on to the I. For I, I've got intensity. So ADHD emotions are often felt more intensely and for longer. Connection can feel deep and meaningful very quickly. Disconnection can feel sudden and real overwhelming and also threatening. So all of the small changes can feel massive. The silence can feel loaded, and the distance can feel like rejection. And again, this is not drama. This is how the ADHD brain processes relational signals. This is where rejection sensitivity, or RSD, comes in. Because RSD isn't about being needy or dramatic. It's about perceived rejection triggering a threat response in the nervous system. Okay? So that response doesn't always look like anger. Often it looks like withdrawal, disengagement, emotional shutdown, or even silence. Think of it like a remote control. That's the way that I say it sometimes. Repeated dismissal or repeated blame or invalidation, that hits the power button and the system's off. Boom, TV off, done. Now when that happens, the sharing stops, explaining stops, future planning disappears. And that's not because the person doesn't care, but their nervous system no longer feels safe. But before I go any further, there's a group of people, I suppose, that I need to address something to directly, because there's people that may be listening to this or may not be, but I know of people that they say the same thing, or they think the same thing, that, oh well, everyone does that and that's just normal, that's just being human, or that just sounds like an excuse. So let's be explicitly clear with this. ADHD is not defined by what someone experiences. It's defined by degree, frequency, intensity, and impact. Everyone gets distracted sometimes. Everyone feels rejected sometimes. Everyone reacts emotionally sometimes. That does not make everyone neurodiverse or make everyone have ADHD. In ADHD, the difference is not opinion-based. It's functional. So people with ADHD show consistent differences in things like how strongly emotions are felt, how quickly reactions happen, the ability to pause before reacting, how strongly the brain responds to motivation, to feedback and emotional signals, and also how long it takes to recover from emotional stress. And these differences, they're not occasional, they're persistent and they show up across situations and they cause real world problems, especially in relationships. And I think that's why ADHD is diagnosed based on impairment and not personality traits, because if it was done that way, I think there's many people that would be neurodiverse, at least. If a behavior happens more often, or it hits harder, lasts longer, and damages relationships, work, or daily functioning, then it's not the same experience, is it? Saying everyone does that is like saying everyone forgets things to someone with dementia, or everyone feels sad to someone with clinical depression. You know, the surface behavior, it may look similar. The underlying mechanism is not. And this part isn't arguable. If these differences were normal for everyone, then ADHD would not meet the clinical threshold required for diagnosis, treatment, or legal recognition. ADHD exists precisely because these differences go beyond the normal variation or the neurotypical variation. So calling it an excuse doesn't make it less real, it just means you don't understand the mechanism. And refusing to understand the mechanism doesn't remove the impact. It shifts the cost onto the person with ADHD. Okay, now that's for a select few that I know, and I know there's going to be more people that have the same opinions or similar ones, and that's directed at you. But we're going to move straight on into C, and C is for communication in this episode. And people with ADHD often they often communicate to regulate. They talk things through to reduce anxiety. They explain to create clarity and revisit issues because unresolved tension feels unbearable. So from the outside, this can look like over talking, overthinking, or even creating problems. But internally, for somebody with ADHD, it's about restoring safety. So when those attempts are met with things like eye rolling or dismissal, minimization, the message received isn't relax, it's your experience doesn't matter. What you're saying is irrelevant. And that there is where emotional damage starts to build. That's where it begins. Which leads us into U, which is understanding. And before I go any further, I need to make this very clear. This section is for the partners of people with ADHD. So if you have ADHD and you're listening, this is not a list of things that you need to fix about yourself. This is not something to internalize or take responsibility for. This is a kind of like a checklist for partners. It's built around real everyday situations to help you recognize patterns that can often go completely unnoticed. It's not about blame, this is about awareness. Okay, so the first question is, when your partner reacts, what do you assume is happening? Let's start here because this is where the most damage begins, I think. When your partner reacts emotionally, gets upset, frustrated, withdrawn or overwhelmed, what's your automatic assumption? Do you think they're being dramatic, they're overreacting, or they're choosing to take this the wrong way? Or do you stop and ask, which is rare, what's just triggered that reaction? A real example I suppose you could take from this is like, say you respond a bit sharply or bluntly after a long day, you don't think much of it, and then your partner goes a bit quiet or gets upset. If your response is to go, oh, here we go again, making a big deal out of nothing, for fuck's sake, oh, it's pathetic, you've already decided your intent. But if you ask, did my tone just feel critical or feel like it was rejecting to them? You're now dealing with the cause, not judgment. You don't have to agree with the reaction, But if you don't understand what triggered it, you will keep repeating the same situation. Every day when you get home, it'll be the same thing. And to you, that may seem like I've just said, oh, here we go again. It's just complete overreaction. An ADHD brain does not have control over that. Then we go into the next question. So, do you expect an ADHD person to calm down before you show connection? This seems to catch a lot of people out, because many partners think, I'll reassure them once they calm down. And that sounds reasonable, for sure. But for ADHD, especially with rejection sensitivity dysphoria, it often doesn't work like that. I say often because everybody's not the same, okay? We need to remember this. Putting this into a real life scenario, say your partner's visibly upset. They're emotional, maybe a bit scattered or intense. You pull back, you go quiet, and you wait. And again, that seems very reasonable, and it can be very reasonable. I guess you kind of need to understand your partner, but if you're still learning about them, it's probably best to try both things and see what response is more positive. But when you do that, what you're thinking is, I'm giving them some space. They need space right now. But what their nervous system experiences and what their brain says to them is that I've been emotionally abandoned. And the difference between the two are so big. Because they put that trust in their person, and 99% of the time, a person with ADHD's person is their partner, the person they're closest to, the person they put all of their trust into. If they feel emotionally abandoned by that person, then it can feel like the world's ending. For people with ADHD, reassurance is what allows regulation to happen, and not the reward for it. So withholding connection until calm arrives, it can unintentionally escalate things, even if your intention is reasonable, which in that scenario it definitely can be. But that's something to consider. Next, when your partner tries to explain, do you hear context or do you hear excuses? Again, this is a big one, because when your partner says something like, this is linked to my ADHD, or this hit me harder than I thought it would, what do you hear? Do you hear deflection, avoidance of the responsibility, or excuses? Or do you hear context, pattern recognition, or an attempt to stop the same thing happening again? Do you hear any of that? Because here's the reality. Explanation is how behavior changes. If explanation is shut down with, you always blame ADHD, then the learning process stops. And when the learning stops, the same issues repeat, just with more resentment each time. And it will just keep growing. So, how do you end difficult conversations? This one's subtle, but it's still important, because there's a big difference between I need a break, let's come back to this later, and there's nothing more to talk about, this is pointless, can we just drop it and move on, let's just get past this. In real life, one says pause and the other says shut down. To many people with ADHD partners, shutdown doesn't feel like a boundary, it feels like abandonment. Even if you need space, how you take it matters. So you may need a break. You may be disengaging from the conversation yourself. It may be getting frustrating for you yourself. This is where the adjustments come into place, and the understanding. With a person with ADHD, the likelihood is they're going to take it as shut down, and they don't care, and this doesn't matter. If you do need to take a break in that situation, that scenario, then make that clear. Make that clear that we are going to revisit this, and make sure that you do that. Like I've mentioned already, clarity is so important. What do you notice when conflict stops? Because a lot of partners think that things are better now, they've stopped bringing it up. But ask yourself this: are they actually calmer, or are they quieter? Do they stop explaining, they stop asking, stop planning, stop sharing? Because that's not resolution, that's self-protection. Silence is often a later stage warning sign, not a sign that things are fixed. So if you do have a partner that completely shuts down and just doesn't say anything, doesn't engage, has nothing much to say at all, the chances are that their brain's telling them to protect themselves. That's what their nervous system's saying, that this is not safe to keep sharing, to keep being open. And when you take that into perspective, how would you feel if your brain was telling you to do that? You'd feel exactly the same. Now, if you have a neurotypical brain and your brain doesn't do that to you, you're at an advantage. Because with ADHD, you don't have control over this. A person's not choosing to be this way. It's just what their brain is making them do, or what it is telling them. One of the biggest parts, I think probably the biggest part, is, are you willing to learn? That, I think, it is the biggest part. It's very, very uncomfortable, but it has to be the most honest. You don't have to become an ADHD expert, but if you're not willing to learn a few key things, or adjust how you communicate when something consistently causes harm, or accept that the relationship requires adaptation, then the $1 million question is this for you? Because if you do any of those things, it doesn't mean that you don't love them. It means that this relationship might not be right for you. Being in a relationship with someone who has ADHD without wanting to adapt is like choosing to live in a country where you refuse to learn or try to understand the language. You're going to be there, say, forever, and you're not going to learn it. You just forget it. I'm just going to keep using Google Translate forever. You might like the place, you might like the people, but day-to-day life will just become frustrated for everyone involved. That's the reality. Love alone doesn't make people compatible. That's a harsh truth. And it leads on to the next thing, I think, quite well, is who's doing the adapting, really. Because people with ADHD adapt literally every single day. It's constant. There's constant masking, regulating, second guessing, compensating. So if the expectation is that they do all the adjusting while you don't change anything, the relationship becomes unbalanced. Shared effort doesn't mean equal effort. It means both people are moving. So you need to be willing to adjust and adapt, because that's already happening for an ADHD brain and person. That moves on to the next thing, which is, are you fixing moments or addressing patterns? And if the same arguments keep happening, ask yourself this: are we treating this as a one-off every single time, or are we recognizing a pattern that needs structure? Because patterns don't change through willpower. They change through systems, agreements, and adjustments. Arguing individual moments just resets the cycle over and over again. Just keep going back to it. And that's when it can feel like a relationship isn't progressing. Every relationship has its hard periods, but over time there should be movement. So you need to ask yourself this honestly. Are conversations leading to change? Are things improving, even slowly? Or are you having the same arguments with different dates? Because relationships don't fail because ADHD exists. They fail when nothing moves forward. And that usually comes from failure to adapt or change or learn. Now, if this section felt uncomfortable, that doesn't make you a bad partner, okay? It usually means something here applies. And awareness is the difference between misunderstanding and unwillingness. Now that leads on to the next part, which is P. The P part of Nick Up in this episode is about progress. This is the part that people avoid because it removes excuses on both sides. Progress in a relationship doesn't come from good intentions. It comes from what actually changes over time. And every relationship reaches a point where one question becomes unavoidable. Are we learning and moving forward, or are we just getting through the days? In relationships where ADHD is involved, progress isn't optional. It's the difference between growth and slow breakdown. Progress shows up in small, boring, unglamorous ways. It looks like wanting to understand instead of wanting to be right, being curious instead of dismissive, and the biggest thing about this section, probably choosing engagement over avoidance. And this is where things like your phone comes into play, because it matters more when people want to admit. If night after night is spent scrolling through TikTok, watching videos, or numbing out on your phone while your relationship is strained, that is not neutral behaviour. That's a choice. That's what you're choosing to do. Meaning you're now choosing to avoid something that could help you long term. So it might be an understandable choice that people are tired, overwhelmed, and to avoid discomfort, but it's still a choice. And over time, that choice communicates something very clearly. This is easier than dealing with us. Now contrast that with what progress actually looks like. Progress looks like a partner who thinks, I don't fully understand ADHD, but I want to. It looks like reading an article, or watching one video, or asking one genuine question, or learning why certain things hurt more than expected. Not to fix anyone, not to win arguments, but to reduce harm going forward. That's the key difference. Learning isn't about blame, it's about prevention. A partner who wants to progress will ask things like, what keeps causing friction and how do we stop it happening again? That's a normal, a typical thing to ask. A person who avoids progress asks, why do we keep having the same arguments? It's ridiculous. It's just the same shit over and over again. Now, those are very different mindsets. And this is also where medication is often misunderstood, okay? Medication does not cure ADHD. It never will. It is impossible. You cannot cure ADHD, okay? It will not remove it, and it doesn't fix relationships. What medication does is just assist, and that's all it will ever do. It can slow your reactions. It can reduce the emotional dysregulation. It can assist with that, and it can increase clarity sometimes. It turns the lights on, I suppose. But medication can't make a partner curious. It can't make someone want to learn, and it can't create effort where there is none. If a relationship only works when one person is medicated, regulated, and constantly compensating, and then it falls apart the moment the other person is asked to engage, that is not progress. That is imbalance. Progress is mutual. It doesn't mean both people do the same amount of work. It means that both people are moving in the same direction. And without progress, relationships don't usually explode, they erode. You get less conversation, less curiosity, less intimacy, and more avoidance. Eventually, what's left isn't a relationship, it's coexistence. And this is the hard truth. If someone is unwilling to learn, unwilling to adapt, and unwilling to engage, that doesn't automatically make them a bad person, but it does mean that this relationship is not for them. It doesn't have no legs. There's no longevity in it. Because love without progress doesn't stabilize relationship. It just delays the ending. It delays the inevitable. Progress requires willingness, and willingness requires effort, and effort shows up in choices. Especially when it would be easier to look away. Let me just repeat those three things. Progress requires willingness, willingness requires effort, and effort shows up in choices. Now, if you're a partner listening, there's some things to understand, okay? You don't need to fix anyone, you don't need to be walking around on eggshells, but you do need to be willing to understand. And if you're someone with ADHD listening, you need to have the confidence to ask early. Ask your partner if they're willing to understand you, and ask if they're open to learning, to therapy or adjustment. Not because you're broken, but because clarity early saves years of pain. Time matters, your well-being matters, your life matters. So find what works, find what's right, and don't waste years waiting for change that isn't coming. Because I promise you now, it hurts and it's damaging. I'm Kyle. This was ADHD Nick Up. Happy New Year to you all. I'll catch you soon.